So, einen wunderschönen guten Abend aus Mannheim. Welcome, good welcome from Mannheim, and good morning to you, Gabriel, to Berkeley. So, welcome to our ZDW book talk. I'm really happy to have Gabriel Zucman here as our speaker tonight. He wrote, together with Emmanuel Says, his book on the triumph of injustice, which really made a lot of noise, one can say, which was very influential. He consulted Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and he really made a strong point in his book. Let me say, before I hand over to you, he will present his book, that I very much enjoyed reading the book. You know, taxes can be cumbersome, yeah, to work on taxes, and it's not everyone's dream, you know, reading at night about a textbook, yeah, a book on taxes. But that's really, it's good to read. So with every chapter, I thought, okay, I'm curious of reading the next chapter. And I must also say it's impressive research which is beyond it. Behind it. So they did, he and his co-authors, it's Emmanuel, but also Thomas Piketty, they do really a great effort of finding out what are the tax systems like, and not just, you know, the last 10 years, but one paper starts in 1700 on the wealth income ratio. They're talking about tax evasion and avoidance, and really to get a measure on it, to get hold on it, it's not a simple task, and they do fantastic research. You find it all, not the papers, but, you know, the results in this book. And as I said, it's really, it's fun to read. There's much to discuss about it. It's, you know, how injustice is the society, where are we, where do we come from, and you know, what is his proposals, your proposals to go beyond the situation. But I would say I hand over to you. He's coming from Berkeley. He's presenting. It's not coming from, it's come from France, but he's professor in Berkeley. This morning he is in Berkeley, very early in Berkeley. So glad that you can make it. And I will hand over to you, Gabriel, your presentation, and we'll discuss it. Thanks a lot for joining us and presenting your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to have the chance to present this book today, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Let me start by sharing my screen to show you some slides. Okay, so I trust this should be good now. So what are we trying to do in this book? With my co-author, Emmanuel Says, we did three things. So that's three main novelties, so to speak. So the book presents new estimates of how much each social group in the US, the working class, the middle class, the rich, has paid in taxes when you include all taxes at all levels of government from the early 20th century to 2018, so the first year after the Trump tax reform that was enacted at the end of 2017. So that's one thing. The second thing is beyond the US. The US is an interesting case for reasons that I'm going to mention, but this is also a book about the world as a whole, you know, Europe, other countries, about how to better address the challenges of globalization, and in particular, how to reconcile globalization with progressive taxation. There is a view according to which these two things are incompatible, that in a globalized world, countries are going to compete with each other. There will be lower corporate taxation, lower tax rates on the more mobile taxpayers like wealthy individuals or high-income earners, and so that you can't have both. We strongly disagree with this view. We think this view is wrong, and we also think it's pretty dangerous. And so what we want to explain in the book is how it's in fact possible to combine globalization and tax justice and progressive taxation, and we make recommendations in that area. The third thing we did, which is more for the US, in the US context, but we hope to develop these tools in other countries, is that we developed a tax simulator that allows users, you know, the general public, you don't need to be an expert about taxes, that allows the public to simulate the effect of various tax reforms. You know, how, for instance, introducing a wealth tax would change effective tax rates for the various groups of the population, what would be the consequence for inequality, and so on. So let me start with the big picture presentation of how the US tax system looks like today after the Trump tax reform. So when we consider all taxes paid at all levels of government in 2018, so federal taxes, but you know, in the US, there are also state taxes, like in California, and also local taxes. Sometimes in cities like New York City have their own income tax. When we take everything into account, we find that contrary to a widely held view, the US tax system is not progressive. I'm going to show you the picture in a second. We also find that for the first time in 2018, billionaires paid a lower effective tax rate than working class Americans. To be more precise, the top 400 wealthiest Americans who've been popularized by Forbes magazine that publishes a ranking of the top 400 wealthiest Americans each year. This group, the top 400, so billionaires broadly speaking, have an effective tax rate these days of around 23%, including everything, including the corporate income tax that they pay through their businesses, as opposed to an average tax rate in the population of about 28%, and most groups paying roughly 28%. So this is how the picture looks like. So on the x-axis, you have the various groups of the income distribution in the US. P010 is the 10% of Americans with the lowest income. P1020 is the next 10%. And we zoom on the right at the very top on the very rich, all the way up to the top 400 richest Americans. And on the y-axis, you have their effective tax rate, which is the total taxes they pay, each group pays, divided by their pre-tax, the total pre-tax income. For the country as a whole, the tax rate is 28%. That's the official tax to national income ratio. For the working class, the bottom 50% of the income distribution, a group that earns about $18,500 on average before taxes and government transfers, for the working class, the effective tax rate is a bit below average, it's around 25%. Then this effective tax rate increases a little bit for the middle class, for the upper middle class, for the bottom of the top 1%. So there is some very mild progressivity, and then a striking decline at the very top end, with billionaires having essentially the lowest tax rates of all these groups that we consider. Now, if we want to understand, what's the reason for that, it's useful to decompose these tax rates by type of tax. So this is the same graph, but showing, the various taxes that contribute to the effective tax rate of each group. So the reason why the working class pays a lot in the US, like in Germany, like in most countries, is two things: consumption taxes. The US doesn't have a VAT like Germany, but it has lots of sales taxes that are even more regressive than a VAT, because these sales taxes only apply to goods. They exempt services, and the poor consume more goods in proportion to their overall consumption than the wealthy, for whom services are more important. So consumption taxes are significant and very regressive. Payroll taxes are very regressive. They're capped at some level of wage, but they start at 15% from the first dollar of wage earned. So that's why the working class pays a lot in taxes. Why is it the case that the very rich do not pay as much as one might think? It's because at the very top end, for billionaires, it's very easy to own a lot of wealth in a way such that this wealth doesn't generate a lot of taxable income. So let me give you one striking example. So Warren Buffett is one of the wealthiest person in the US, and he disclosed in 2016 that his taxable income was just of the order of $10–20 million. His wealth is estimated to be $80 billion or in that ballpark, but his taxable income is tiny compared to his wealth. Why? Because his company, Berkshire Hathaway, doesn't distribute dividends, and he doesn't sell shares of his company, and so he can choose to report very, very little income, and he pays some taxes out of that taxable income, but compared to his true economic income, which is his share of Berkshire Hathaway's profits, a very profitable business, compared to his true economic income, his taxable income is very low. And so that's why, and And he's not an exception. You know, when you look at Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, you know, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the founders of Google, all of them are big shareholders of companies that do not distribute dividends. And so they have a very high ability to pay. They're very, very wealthy, but they in practice pay very little in taxes. So the other reason, that's what, you know, this slide is just repeating what I just said and just adding something, which is another reason why the effective tax rate of the wealthy is low is because capital income, broadly speaking, is taxed at low rates in the US. I mentioned the problem of, you know, corporate retained earnings, so profits that are not distributed to shareholders, but you also have reduced tax rates on dividends and capital gains. So for instance, wage income in the US today is taxed at 37% for the highest wages, while dividends and capital gains, which are earned mostly by the wealthy, are taxed only at 20% at most. And the last thing is the collapse of corporate taxation. So now that's the graph I want to show about that. So I was pretty struck. It is a very simple computation, but I had never realized how extreme the evolution has been. This is contrasting federal tax revenues in the US coming from the individual income tax, that's the top line, and the corporate income tax, expressed as a fraction of US national income. And you can see that at some point after World War II, the corporate tax was a really big source of government revenue. It raised about as much as 7% of national income, almost as much as the individual income tax. Then individual tax revenues kind of flatlined, and there's been a dramatic decline in corporate income tax revenues. You know, so now the corporate tax has essentially almost disappeared, collects less than 1%. Around 1% of US tax revenues. The consequence of this is, you know, if you start from the very first graph that I showed, effective tax rates by income group in 2018, and you do the same computation back in time in 2010, in 2000, 1990, all the way back to 1950, you realize that in the post-World War II decades, the US tax system was extremely progressive, with effective tax rates at the top of 60, 70% for the wealthiest Americans, in particular because of these very high effective corporate income tax rates. So the wealthy did pay a lot of taxes because they owned corporations that were taxed at high rates. And then you had a gradual decline in tax progressivity all the way to the current situation of, essentially a tax system that looks like a giant flat tax that becomes regressive at the very top of the distribution. Okay, so now let me talk about solutions, because that's frankly what I'm more interested in. I think that's what's more important in this book. What we try to do is to provide some new ideas to, contribute to building a tax system for the 21st century, one that would work for the US, but that would work for other countries as well, because the trends that have happened in the US, the rise of tax avoidance, of tax evasion, the rise of tax competition, the decline in tax progressivity, these trends are by no means unique to the US. They're particularly spectacular in the US because tax progressivity, the US tax system used to be so progressive and today is not very much progressive, but the same trends have happened elsewhere. So in terms of solution, I'm going to emphasize two things here. One is a plan, so to speak, to reconcile globalization with tax justice by stopping corporate tax evasion and tax competition. And the second is a plan for a wealth tax. Okay, so let me start with the corporate tax. So what I want to emphasize is that the type of globalization that we have today is characterized by a very negative form of international tax competition, namely very negative form of international competition, namely tax competition. So countries compete by slashing their corporate tax rates to attract profits, to attract companies, business activity, to attract capital more broadly. And many people have a view that this is the only, possible form of globalization, that, tax competition is a law of nature. But this is not true. The way that globalization operates is the current form of globalization is only one possible form of globalization. And there are many other possible forms of globalization. The treaties of globalization are not set in stone. So for instance, we have international treaties, for instance, very developed and sophisticated for trade. And we've made a huge progress in terms of coordinating trade policies. And that's a good thing. But these trade agreements do not talk at all about taxes. And it's unlikely that it's possible to talk about trade, especially when trade agreements these days are essentially about intellectual property protection, protections for investors, broadly speaking, while not talking at all about taxes. And so you could imagine, a new type of agreements where taxes would be put at the heart of future trade deals, and in particular where international coordination on tax rates, such as agreeing to a minimum corporate income tax rate of, let's say, 25%, would be put as a precondition for any further trade liberalization. You might also, that requires a lot of international coordination, but there are also many things that countries can do unilaterally to limit tax competition and tax avoidance by multinational companies. And here, the example that I think is quite relevant is what happened with bank secrecy. So, when I started my studies, my PhD studies 12, 13 years ago, there was a complete bank secrecy. There was a complete lack of information exchange between banks in Switzerland, let's say, and foreign countries' tax authorities. And so in that context, it was very easy for some people to hide assets in offshore banks, in tax havens. And then this changed when the United States in 2010 unilaterally imposed, threatened Swiss banks with economic sanctions if these banks refused to exchange information with the tax authority, the US tax authority. And under that pressure, Swiss banks agreed to cooperate, and then other countries followed suit, and this led to the emergence of a new form of international cooperation, the automatic exchange of bank information, which is a reality today, which is a huge progress compared to the situation 10, 15 years ago. And 10, 15 years ago, everybody thought that nothing could be done to fight bank secrecy, to improve information exchange, that, if Switzerland wanted to have a complete bank secrecy, it was, their right, and that there was no way to make the Cayman Islands, change, and Jersey and so on. But now, things have really changed. And so this shows that there is nothing inherent in globalization that would mean that there has to be more tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax competition. The choice really is ours. It's a policy choice. Okay, second thing I wanted to talk about is the wealth tax. And let me start by just emphasizing that there is a long tradition of very progressive taxation in the US. Many people, for some reason, have forgotten about that tradition in the US. So it's worth starting from there. It's worth remembering that the US pioneered steeply progressive taxation with top estate tax rates, so for inheritance, of more than 70%, most of the time 77% from the period 1936 to 1980, with top marginal income tax rates above 90% during World War II, in the 1950s and 1960s, with even higher rates on capital income, so close to 100%, with plans, during the New Deals, for instance, for very progressive, not only income, but wealth taxes, the famous Share the Wealth plan of Huey Long, for instance, who wanted to cap wealth at $50 million of the time, so a few $1 billion of today's wealth. So basically, the US invented the notion, in many ways, of using the tax system to impose a maximum income or maximum wealth. And where does that come from? Well, it's something that's deeply rooted in U.S. history. There is a long history of concerns about the risk of oligarchic drift and the risk of capture of the republic by private interests. This theme runs deep in U.S. history from James Madison in the late 18th century to at least Roosevelt during the New Deal and even the subsequent administrations after World War II. The idea is that if you read, for instance, Madison, the father of the U.S. Constitution, who is still considered as a hero today by modern day Republicans. Madison writes at the end of the 18th century that an extreme concentration of wealth is as poisonous for a republic as being in a state of war, and that the role of political parties should be to prevent the excessive accumulation of wealth by a small minority. And why was this view so prevalent? It's because Europe was at the time, for a very long time, seen as a kind of anti-model by Americans, as excessively unequal, undemocratic, aristocratic, and something that was to be avoided at all costs. That's one way to understand the sharp increase in tax progressivity that happened in the US, in the middle of 20th century. That I just mentioned previously. So building on that, one of the ideas that we propose in the book is to kind of extend that tradition and reinvent it for the 21st century by adding a progressive wealth tax on extreme wealth. So for instance, if you look at the wealth tax proposal that was formulated by Senator Elizabeth Warren, during the primaries, and then bill was introduced in Congress actually last week. It's a tax that would work as follows. So it's if you have $50 million in net wealth, you pay zero. If you have 50 million or less, you pay zero. And any dollar above 50 million, you pay 2% on that extra dollar. And for billionaires, it's a tax rate of 3% above $1 billion. So what we show is that, if you add that wealth tax to the current US tax system, here is how this would change the progressivity of the US tax system. So you see, it would make quite a big difference, in terms of making now the tax system significantly much more progressive and getting back to levels of progressivity that you could see in the 1950s or 1960s or 70s. There are many other things I wanted to talk about, but I think it's more interesting if I conclude and we can have a discussion, and I can get back to some of these points maybe during the discussion. And so let me conclude by saying that one of our main conclusions is that the widely held view that external or technical constraints make tax justice impossible today is, in our view, is wrong. There is technically nothing in globalization that prevents progressive taxation. Tax competition is not a law of nature, it's a policy choice. Tax evasion is the same. Governments can choose to tolerate the supply of tax avoidance and tax evasion services. There's a whole industry that helps corporations, wealthy individuals avoid taxes. Governments can choose to tolerate or even to encourage this industry, or they can choose to regulate this industry. And so what this means is that there is an infinity of possible future policy paths. And to conclude, I think that where economists can be helpful is not by saying that the tax rate should be X or Y. No, that's a choice for the people through democratic deliberation and the vote. It's not for economists to say. Where economists can be useful is by helping make more concrete the multiplicity of possible policy paths. And it's also by being a bit more like plumbers. Esther Duflo has this famous article in The Economist as a plumber, which I like very much. And I think it works quite well in the context of taxation. You have leaks in the tax system. There is tax avoidance, tax evasion. Taxes work, sometimes quite well, sometimes they work poorly. And where economists can be useful is by helping fix the leaks, such that if there is a democratic demand for more progressive taxation, this can actually work in practice. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. Very impressive. And yeah, a lot of food for thought. Let me start with my first question, which is, your title suggests there's something wrong. The triumph of injustice, it's not an invitation to academic consultation, but there's something really wrong in the United States. However, we are where we are in a democratic system. That's what the people voted for. Yeah, and we changed the structure in the United States. We have seen the tax rate coming down and down and down. This is the result of elections. So if that's the wish of the people, why do you complain?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I would say two things. One is that when you look at opinion polls and when you ask people in the US, it's also true in other countries, do you think that the wealthy pay enough in taxes? And in the US, the vast majority of people these days say, no, we don't think so. Do you think that corporations pay enough in taxes? And the majority says, no, we don't think that's true. They should pay more. Even more striking, when there's been a number of polls conducted on a progressive wealth tax, such as the one I described, starting at $50 million in net wealth. When you ask Americans, do you support such a wealth tax? More than 70% of Democrats say they support such a wealth tax. But more interesting, more than 50% of Republican voters and more than 50% of independents also say that they support such a progressive wealth tax. So there is, in fact, a real, and this is, I'm talking about many polls, conducted over many years. This is a very robust finding. There is a real demand for a fairer tax system in the US. And what has happened to taxation, the dramatic decline in tax progressivity, I don't think that this is the outcome of a rational, well-informed democratic debate. This is the result of the rise of tax avoidance, the rise of tax evasion, the growing feeling that in a globalized world, you don't get to choose anymore what tax rates you want to apply to certain tax bases, that countries have to play the tax competition game. So kind of forces that have prevailed essentially without consulting voters, and at least it doesn't reflect the democratic will of the people. It's not the outcome of a well thought through democratic process. That's what we think.
Globalization really has speed up this process, yeah, and so you could say people are not yet well informed at this stage, and they have to learn, and that's really your book helped to learn about the situation. I'm always a little bit skeptical about the informational issue, because if it's really important, then that's the job of the party to tell the people, that's the issue to care of. And if you say the majority is in favor of it, maybe it has changed, maybe majority is shifting, and maybe it's a good time. We see in other issues like climate policy, majorities are shifting, yeah. But it could also be, it's like this survey paradox. On Sunday, they want the wealth tax. On Mondays, when they have to vote, they vote against it, yeah. So Bernie Sanders didn't win, and Elizabeth Warren. So Joe Biden won on the Democratic side, yeah. So maybe it's, maybe we are still in the will of the people, yeah. Put it like that.
Yeah, I think some of the changes that have happened were the results of conscious choices. No, of course, there's been massive ideological change in the US in between, the post-World War II decades and the victory of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and yes, so. First, it's true that there is a strong anti-tax sentiment in the US. Second, it's true that this anti-tax, anti-government sentiment has been on the rise, in the years leading to the victory of Ronald Reagan. And so, that is absolutely correct. But many more of the choices or the non-choices that have happened in terms of tax policy have been born passively. Nobody supports the outbreak, or few people, support the outbreak of, the tax avoidance industry, or the emergence with globalization of new loopholes that have been exploited by multinational companies. These changes are not due to a sudden popular appetite for exempting the wealthy. When you look again at opinion polls, this is not what you see. But mostly these are forces that have prevailed without inputs from voters to a large extent.
Yeah, maybe we shift and we come back to this issue, to the proposals you make, and one which is, I would say, it's less controversial, but nothing is not controversial in politics, is international taxation. Yeah, and you make a strong point that we can choose, and what we see is that these are small states where tax avoidance takes place. It's not tax evasion, it's tax avoidance, because many play to the rules, but still they shift money to Ireland, to the Switzerland, Europe, yeah, or Cayman Islands, or what is in the States. They also have their Puerto Rico, Bermuda, they shift money there. And I'm a competition economist, and I think it's not fair. Yeah, so it's not fair competition. But then my public finance people argue, yes, but first of all, we need it's infrastructure competition. It's not tax competition. It's both. It's infrastructure. So it's good to have competition between states. We should not undermine the competition with a minimum tax. Yeah, the OECD is trying to have a minimum tax. And the second argument is we need also tax competition to discipline government. Yeah, so tax competition helps us. So these are two arguments against having, I would say against having a joint tax, not against having a minimum tax. But what's your argument? So are they wrong? Is it not more than tax competition? Is it not infrastructure competition which we see?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So let me start with the second question, which is, do we need tax competition? So there is a view that indeed we need it, that tax competition is a way to discipline the welfare states, and the big European welfare states, according to that view, would be unable to kind of reform themselves. They would keep increasing taxes forever, and by having tax competition, it's an external force that forces them to be more efficient and to have lower tax rates. And I think the problem with that argument is that it reflects too much of a distrust for democracy. So this is an argument according to which is, at the end of the day, people are unable to govern themselves rationally. When it comes to taxation, governments people will always vote for too high taxes. They will kind of be tempted to expropriate. People who are proponents of that view are very afraid about the risk of majorities expropriating a minority of property owners. And look, I'm more optimistic about the ability of people to govern themselves rationally through a democratic process. And I think the view that you need not only constitutional constraints to taxation, but Italy needs Malta, that Greece needs Cyprus, that France and Germany need Luxembourg, kind of external actors, states that are going to force them to cut taxes by playing the tax competition game. I think it's at the end of the day, profoundly anti-democratic view, and one that reflects a strong and, in my view, excessive pessimism regarding democracy. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I totally agree with you that in a globalized world, countries compete with each other, but we need to think about what form of competition we want to have. Right now, we have a very negative form of competition, which is tax competition. And I don't think that this form of competition is quite sustainable, because With tax competition, what you have is that the main winners from globalization, multinational companies and their shareholders, see their taxes fall, while at the same time, the groups of the population who have not benefited a lot from globalization or sometimes have suffered from it tend to see their taxes increase. And this is a very perverse process. The notion that economic integration would be good for everybody was predicated on the notion that governments would tax the winners of globalization to redistribute any gains. But what we're saying is the precise opposite of that, is that the main winners see their taxes actually fall. And it's pretty obvious that this is not sustainable, neither economically nor politically. I think it's actually a very dangerous process, which at the end of the day can only lead to a profound rejection of globalization and economic integration by the people. And so I think it's extremely important to explain how we could have other forms of international competition. So let me talk about minimum taxation. What would happen in a world where, let's say, well, to be even simpler, what would happen in a world where all countries had the exact corporate income tax rate? So no tax competition anymore. Well, countries would still compete with each other, but they would compete by trying to provide the best infrastructure. They would compete by having the most productive workforce. So the best universities, the best schools. And so they would compete in a way that would benefit most of the population, better infrastructure, better schools, and in a way that people would like that. Most people would like that form of international competition. And so with minimum taxation, I think you can change from the current globalization, characterized by negative competition, tax competition, to another form of globalization that would reconcile the people with globalization.
So it's good to hear that you still believe strongly in democracy, even living in the United States. You voted for Trump, yeah. So, no, fair enough. But there's also an economic argument, and that's the time inconsistent behavior. So the worry that you invest somewhere, and then the government expropriates you, and we have seen that. And I know there was a paper some time ago here by a colleague from Mannheim, University of Mannheim, Eckhard Janibar, that might be one reason so that international companies can shift, and they are not, they don't have the worry that I invest, say, in China or I invest somewhere, and then the government changes its policy, and I have sunk costs and I can't get out of it. But I don't want to stress this point. So it's not just, believing in government or not. The government can be time inconsistent. That's why we give monetary policy to an independent institution, because of this worry. But tax competition in Europe, the Eastern Europeans, they would say it's our only way to compete with low taxes. We don't have the same infrastructure. We don't have the same legal structure. We don't have the same education level. If you take us tax competition, you take us the chance that we can compete against Germany or France in that respect. And so is there, at least for the Eastern Europeans, or probably also for Ireland, there is an argument to be made that their chance to reach the level which France has reached or Germany, they need to have this instrument tax competition, otherwise they won't reach this stage. Yeah, what would you say?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and I think, look, I understand this argument, but at the same time, I would say that I think it is short-sighted, because I think a development model that's founded on lower taxes, tax competition, is inherently unstable. It works as long as first of all, why is it inherently unstable? Because it's non-cooperative. No, it's essentially zero-sum, trying to attract activities or paper profits at the expense of other countries, in many cases at the expense of other countries who are also part of the European Union. And it can only work if those other countries accept this. But at some point, they may also say, look, we don't accept that anymore. And in that case, the whole strategy predicated on tax competition kind of falls apart. So in particular, look what could happen very, very concretely. So right now, if a company books profits in Ireland, the profits are taxed at 12.5%, the Irish rate, or even sometimes much lower than that, could be 6% for intellectual property, or close to 0%, like for Apple, for instance, according to the EU Commission. And that's the way it works. And other countries have not done much to try to address that situation. But they could say, oh, look, companies that book profits in Ireland, it's the right of Ireland to collect low taxes, but if they collect little taxes, we're going to collect extra taxes to kind of offset the low taxes paid in tax havens. So for instance, for each multinational company, a country like Germany could compute the tax deficit of each company. The tax deficit is the difference between what a company pays in taxes globally and what it would have to pay if its profits were taxed at a minimum rate, let's say 25%, country by country. Now, the German tax authorities have the information to compute the tax deficit of each multinational company, not only the German companies, but foreign multinationals as well. And then Germany could say, look, okay, the companies that don't have a tax deficit, that's fine, we change nothing. And those that have a tax deficit, we're going to collect some of that tax deficit. We're going to play a role of tax collector of last resort. For instance, if a company makes 10% of its sales in Germany, we're going to collect 10% of their global tax deficit. And so the idea is, okay, countries can choose to have low tax rates, that's their right. Multinational companies can shift profits to those countries, but we are going to offset that with higher taxes in Germany. This could be done unilaterally. Germany could start doing that next year. And you see very quickly how it can put an end to tax competition, because imagine that Germany does that next year. And it demonstrates that it can collect more tax revenues from the companies that by definition pay too little, have a tax deficit. Then other countries would probably take a close look and say, oh, look, there is money on the table for us to grab. So we, France, Italy, Spain, we're also going to start collecting part of the tax deficit. And as soon as sufficiently many countries do that, collect some of the tax deficit of multinationals, it becomes pointless for multinational companies to book profits in Ireland or in the Cayman Islands. The lower taxes paid there would be offset by higher taxes in Germany, in Italy, in France. And so you would see, it would destroy the development model that's based on low taxes and tax competition. And so that's why I say it's inherently unstable. And I think I think a growing number of people in in low tax countries understand that it's becoming really urgent to think of alternative development models for those countries. And a model that's predicated on just low taxes, stealing a bit of revenues from other countries, it's not going to work for many more years.
Yeah, but it's, I would say, not as simple as it sounds. The French try to have a digital tax, or they have a digital tax, and it's not unilateral. The Americans were upset they got tariffs on French products, and so I guess that we have a joint effort by the OECD states, so to have a joint minimum tax. That's probably the way to go, so that we do it collaboratively, jointly together. And so we will see how far the OECD can push it. Yeah, that's the plan, to have a joint minimum tax across states. Maybe one question which I wondered how relevant this issue is. And I saw in your book you have estimates for the United States that these tax evasion or tax avoidance, this international tax avoidance, would be about 100 billion in taxes. Is that the right figure? Because I just saw a recent study on Germany, and they argued what our multinational companies are, transferring profits to other states. If you tax that, it would rather amount to 6 billion. So that was a figure I read for Germany, 6 billion, which is, Germany is smaller than the United States, but even 6 billion to 100 billion it's a large difference. So I wonder, the question would be first, how relevant is, and second, do you have information on Europe? How big is that an issue for Europe, this tax shifting?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And so the information we have on this issue, so with my colleagues, Ludwig Wehr and Thomas Torsloff, we did a study, The Missing Profits of Nations, trying to quantify the global amount of profit shifting and the global loss of tax revenues that's caused by this profit shifting. And we found that close to 40% of multinational profit, which are defined as profits made by companies outside of the country where they're headquartered, like profits made by BMW outside of Germany or Apple outside of the US, 40% of those, almost 40% are booked in tax havens today. And so this represents about $700 billion today, with a loss of tax revenue globally that's of the order of 200 billion dollars in round numbers. And the estimates that exist from the OECD, has done a lot of work to quantify base erosion and profit shifting, are very much consistent with that. The estimates of other international organizations like UNCTAD, for instance, are also very consistent with that. And so it's likely to be in the right ballpark. Then when you look at which companies are the main shifters of profits, the most aggressive in terms of shifting profits, what you see is that these are US multinationals that tend to be particularly aggressive. And so that's the way to reconcile the numbers we have with the US with what you mentioned for Germany. So Germany loses quite a lot of tax revenues because of corporate profit shifting. Part of this is because German companies shift profits out of Germany. And that's what was quantified in this German study that you referred to. But the bigger part is actually because foreign multinationals, especially US multinationals, think Amazon, Netflix, Apple, Google, Facebook, shift profits out of Germany to places like Luxembourg, like Ireland, and so on. And quantitatively, this is actually much bigger. For a number of reasons, I'm happy to talk about that. But in that German study that you mentioned, they just they didn't capture that. Just look at German firms, BMW, and so on. They do some profit shifting, but not as much as the US multinationals.
Okay, that explains that. And I hadn't mentioned that in the beginning, but you have a new job. You are heading the European Tax Observatory. Yeah, so that's a new job for you and your team. So is that kind of the task you will be doing, to analyze how taxes are moving across Europe? Is that what are you doing there? Yeah, is that
two things? We want to do two things. One is to conduct research at the highest international level on tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax competition, and the potential solutions to these problems. And the second thing is to formulate ideas, concrete proposals for improving policies in that area at the EU level. Again, the idea is not to say we have the answers to the problems. No, the idea is to put in the debate, to help make the tax debate more democratic. Especially in the EU, there is a major need for this, and to do proposals that people can discuss, and that's what we are going to be doing.
Oh, great. I'm looking forward to the results out of your tax observatory. So one is the international taxation, and that's already, it's contentious, but I would say to less degree. What is even more contentious are your proposals for wealth tax, or at least in Germany, we have this debate on a wealth tax. And let me maybe start with one argument. You say that the value-added tax, the rich, they save, so they don't pay taxes, yeah, and they keep, Warren Buffett keeps his money into the company, so he doesn't pay taxes on his dividends. It's no dividends, it's inside, it's retained earnings. But that's right, but that's money he can't use. As soon as he wants to use it, he has to spend it. Yeah. So one question I wonder is how fair it is to have a cross-sectional view. You just view it, what is the expenses and the taxes in 1 year, but wouldn't it be fairer to have a life cycle perspective? Because if Warren Buffett wants to spend his money, he has to pay taxes. He has to get it out of his company, he has to pay dividend taxes, or corporate taxes, and if he wants to consume it, he has to pay value-added tax or consumption tax. Yeah. So isn't it unfair to say because he saves, he's not being taxed? Yeah, but as soon as he uses his money, he will be taxed.
I think it's a great question. It's a some level, it's a philosophical question. Do you think that what should be taxed is consumption, or do you think that the tax system should be based on your ability to pay taxes? Now, my intellectual tradition, I want to be very clear about that, is I think that taxes should be based on ability to pay. And I think that billionaires, they are billionaires, they have a high ability to pay taxes. Now, and so I think they should pay a lot. And if they paid more, people with less of an ability to pay taxes, with lower wealth and income, could pay less. Now, there is another kind of intellectual philosophical tradition that says, oh no, look, the tax system should be based on what you consume. And if you consume very little, if you're a billionaire, but you keep all your income in your company, no dividends, and so very little consumption, then you should not pay much in taxes. Well, okay, now I think the main problem with this is that you end up in a situation where, if you tax consumption, it means saving, is tax-free. So, Warren Buffett can keep growing his wealth year after year by retaining income in his company tax-free. And that's going to lead to an increasing concentration of wealth. That's going to lead to more and more wealth inequality by, if you don't tax saving and the rich save more. And well, if you don't care about wealth concentration at all, it's not a problem. But also, I want to be clear about that. I do care about wealth inequality because I think that, for most people, wealth is safety. It's a good thing to have wealth. But for the very, very rich, wealth is power. And so an extreme concentration of wealth means an extreme concentration of power, of economic power, of the power to influence ideology, of the power to buy new entrants, competitors, the power to influence the law, to fight the tax agencies. So that's the problem with this, kind of philosophy of let's just tax consumption. I think at the end of the day, you have to confront the risk of too much wealth concentration. And I think people in the US, there is a long, as I mentioned briefly in the presentation, there is a long historical intellectual tradition that takes these concerns very seriously, across political parties. I mentioned Madison, Roosevelt. And I think today these concerns are certainly making a comeback for good reasons.
I'm very happy with this argument against power. As a competition economist, that's what we do. Monopolies are not good. But the other point is, I would say, I'm not a philosopher. I'm just, I see my simple public finance models. And if you have consumption tax on the left-hand side, it's the same. If you divide through, it's the same as wealth tax on the right-hand side, because as soon as you consume your wealth, it's being taxed. Yeah, but phrase it as a question. I'm pushing this life cycle hypothesis. So we did one study at the ZEW, and we did a study, or we did several studies, but who is profiting from state benefits, in the health system and in the education system that is being paid by the state, and it's the poorer are profiting more from it. But if you take a life cycle perspectives for education, for example, it's not the poor, because every year it's the poor they profit, but during your life cycle, it's the rich they study, or the richer. They study, the kids of the richer study, and in Europe study is free, and so during the life cycle, the rich get more education invested into them from the state than the poor. If you take a cross-sectional view, it's the poor who get it. And so I wondered with the tax system, what you're comparing is the tax distribution in a given year. Yeah, wouldn't it be more sensible, to take also there a life cycle perspective? Because tax systems, and if the rich consumes, then he has a different tax system, and maybe in Germany we have a pension system, but if you are self-employed, you don't get pension by the state. So it would be unfair to say the self-employed are richer because they don't get pension by the state, while we are part of the pension system by the state. So the question would be, isn't not the life cycle the right perspective rather than taking 1 year?
I think it's a fair question. I think it's good to have different perspectives, and you're absolutely right that the figures I showed are for a cross section of people. These are not the same people from 1 year to the other, and there is value in also trying to estimate taxes paid over the life cycle and government transfers received over the life cycle. I think these are two valuable approaches. Now, if you try to think about, at least in the US context, how the life cycle perspective would change the findings, I think it might make some changes to the profile of progressivity or lack of progressivity of the current tax system today. I don't know exactly how it would change it, but it's likely that there would be some changes. But I don't think it would really change the trends, the big picture trends, which is, the most important thing, which is that the wealthy used to pay a lot in taxes in the US when the corporate tax rate was really high, when the estate tax was high, when the top marginal income tax rate was high, and that today they pay much less. That I think would remain true. And second, what we know about income mobility in the US is the following. There is some income mobility. That is, some people move from one group, let's say the bottom 50%, to another group, let's say the middle class. But it's not the case that this mobility has changed significantly over time. That is, so it's still the same probabilities today than 30 or 40 years ago, which means that the increase in cross-sectional inequality translates almost 1-for-1 into an increase in life cycle income inequality. To put it differently, Warren Buffett is rich, he's a billionaire, and he's always a billionaire, and people are not, switching from being a burger flipper to being a billionaire and then back to burger flipper. That's just not, what happened.
I'm not sure how many, you said these are the 400 top richest, whether those 400 should determine the tax system for the other 250, 300 million Americans. It's good to have a rule for them, but maybe one more on the wealth tax. We have this debate in Germany, and one argument being made is that we abolished the wealth tax, and for reasons. Yeah, one reason is it could be harmful for the companies. So you destroy, if you take 10% wealth tax, that means that the owners of BMW have to sell every year 10% of their company. So that's, that could destroy a company. That's one argument being made. Second argument being made is that it's really hard to measure. So, how much is the house being worth? There's no, the carpet at the wall, how much is it worth, the painting? So wealth taxes are a mess. These are the two arguments. So I know the United States have a wealth tax, so, and I guess, but have you a good argument why that should not be a hindrance against wealth tax in Europe or in Germany?
Yeah, it's a very important question. So you're absolutely right that there is a long history of wealth taxation in Germany, in many European countries, and it's not been a huge success. I want to be clear about that because of a number of problems. I would say that the main problem was, three equally important problems. One was tax competition. So you could avoid the wealth tax in Germany by moving to Switzerland, let's say, so, a low tax country. And Germany, like other European countries, never tried anything to limit tax competition. So you could imagine that Germany, could say, oh, we are going to tax German taxpayers who move abroad for at least a number of years after they move. You could do that. Any country could do that. The US taxes US citizens, no matter where they live in the world until they die. So you could say we are going to tax German residents who move abroad for 5-10 years. No, but European countries never did that. There was tax evasion, the second problem, with until 10 years ago, no effort at fighting wealth concealment in Switzerland. So there was very big lack of political will. And there was the problem that you mentioned, which is that, that's connected to what you mentioned, is that these wealth taxes, in effect, had all sorts of exemptions and deductions because people felt that, taxing businesses is complicated. You have to value businesses, and it's bad for businesses. And so you had exemptions for, big shareholders, for instance, reduced rates, ceiling mechanisms where you could not pay more than X% of your income in wealth tax. And so all of these kind of reduced the base and led to, in effect, the very wealthy paying very low rates and sometimes zero wealth tax. Now, I think we have to learn from that history to try to improve. And I think it's possible to do much better in the 21st century. So the key principle, I think, should be to tax all assets at their market values. So many assets have observable market values, listed securities, even real estate. Now you have websites that give in real time the value of each house. So that's not complicated. In the case of big private businesses, you can value them. You look at the profits they make, the sales they make, you compare that to the market values of listed companies in the same sector of the same size. So, there are solutions to this. And I think one virtue of starting higher in the wealth distribution, of having a higher exemption threshold, like, 50 million in the US, could be 20 million in Germany, is that it would be much easier to say, well, above that very high wealth level, obviously you're very, very rich. So you don't need any exemption or deduction. All your wealth at market value is going to be taxed at 2-3% and so on.
No, actually, we have the debate also with the inheritance taxation, and we also think the first step would be to get rid of the loopholes, then have start at a higher level, but then do a fair taxation. Yeah, so actually, there are many economists also arguing in that direction. We are running out of time. I have one question which I have to pose. We have one study here where we investigated how is research being done in Europe, and it turns out that we are all a little bit biased. So the Germans do different kind of research than the French do, than the Italians do, for example, with respect to the debt brake. And here in this regard, it's there is a French connection. Yeah, Thomas Piketty is very successful in Europe with his book. You and Emmanuel, you're pushing, you are a driving force for justice in taxation in the United States. Is this just by accident? Is it because you're coming all of the same school? Is this would you say there is some French touch to it, or is it just good economics, which it is?
I think a growing number of economists are interested in these distributional issues. So it's true that in the post-World War II decades, economics was really mostly about efficiency. Comparing the efficiency of a market economy with the efficiency of a planned economy in the Cold War context. And okay, that made sense at the time, and we made a lot of progress, and we established a number of results that show that under certain conditions, markets work well, and under certain other conditions, they don't work well. And we've made a lot of progress as a scientific community. But when you take a longer perspective, you realize that distributional issues have always been at the center of the discipline, back to the 19th century. And so what's happening these days is that these distributional questions are making a comeback at the center of the discipline, and that's it's a broader phenomenon that just goes way beyond the work we're doing. That's more general than that.
Happy with this answer, and I fully agree. I think it's an academic field. We have here at the ZEW a group working on distribution, and it's a fascinating topic. We need much more to learn about it, and it's a worldwide topic. It's neither a French nor a German topic, and I'm very happy for this answer. So we come to an end. So we start strict on time, we end strict on time. Maybe that's still German, I don't know. I would like to recommend to you viewers, so thanks for joining. We have our next meeting in March 23rd. Which will be the report of the Expert Commission on Research and Innovation, the EFI-Kommission. And Irene Bercek, who's member of this commission and member of our ZEW, she will report the result, but there will also be a debate with the head of the new Commission for Sprunginnovation, our new way of supporting innovation in Germany. So thanks a lot, Gabriel, for this fascinating talk. It's a great topic, and I guess we will hear much more of you in Europe now that you are head of the European Tax Observation. It's fun talking to you, and all the best. Regards. Have a nice day. We have a nice evening, I hope, our viewers, and thanks for joining. Also,
Thank you so much for having me.
Ja, vielen Dank. Ich wünsche allen einen schönen Abend. Vielen Dank, dass Sie zugeschaut haben. Und wir sehen uns am 23. März wieder, hoffe ich. Okay, also have a good night, have a good day, Gabriel. Thanks and goodbye.